Hello, and welcome to Truth 10, Truth of Silence and Simplicity. Today's universal law is the principle of rhythm. The Kabbalion states everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifests in everything. The measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. On the right, I have the picture of the seasons. The seasons is one way to demonstrate this principle in the earthly world. If you're familiar with shamanism, the medicine wheel, in astrology, we have the cardinal houses or the circular nature of the wheel. In alchemy, we have the four main stages of alchemy. We see the circular rhythm of the earth and the universe in this law. Spiritual growth is circular and spherical. It is not hierarchical. Anything that has to do with hierarchy, climbing a ladder, moving up the rungs, all has to do with the earthly element. It is the square that we talked about in the law of octaves, and it must die. Spherical and circular is the universe and the highest plane of the universe called the monad. This is also linked to the principle of mentalism, where we create everything and all is mind. It's circular. Sometimes it's hard for people to understand this in the seven planes of the universe because of the way that they're sort of delineated is in an order from top to bottom. The reality is that they're more like circles where the density is on the external and it starts going more and more and more inward. There's a beautiful concept called the koshas in Ayurveda that also shows this. So it's our core self, our Atman or our soul, and then we've got these koshas or layers outside of self that are denser and denser in nature. So this rhythm just speaks to how everything is cyclical. And we're going to be talking a little bit about the narrow gate and winter as the season of seeking answers within. So this myth of Hercules is Hercules having to go down to the underworld and defeat Cerberus. He wants to help Prometheus. Prometheus is the god that stole the fire from the gods, and Zeus punished him. This is extremely important. Fire is symbolic of our transmutation of belief, so growing in our consciousness. It's also the element that can burn or make us take emotion to feeling, so we can feel the emotion through our body. In the earthly matter, the body, it's Agni, which is the digestive fire that helps us use the food that we eat. So it's the element of fire that not only cooks our food, keeps us warm, but what Zeus understood was that if humans had transmutation capacity to shift their beliefs, that then they could reach godlike status. And so he punished Prometheus and attached him to a rock where a liver ate out his, a vulture ate out his liver every day and night. And being that Prometheus was a god, this was for eternity. So he's in the underworld with Hades, and Hercules is said to go help free Prometheus. And Pluto or Hades says, sure, as long as you can defeat my three-headed dog, Cerberus. We've talked about Cerberus before. In my model, the three heads are thought, emotion, and desire. Within creates the low-level consciousness of the human being, and Prometheus being freed represents symbolically the ability for us to transmute our low-level consciousness and stay with our obviously flawed, limited form. So I have here, what's your personal hell? It is through your individual experience. It's through your earthly story. It's what you lived, what pain and suffering you encountered, that you can then experience the universe. And by then, the human suffering, and then eventually in Truth 11, give back as a servant. You cannot learn by hearsay. So this truth is about when to stay silent, when to just have grace and hold space, when to simplify what you're commenting and giving back to someone. And sometimes it's just a matter of holding space. So I have a concept that I call hard edges and soft corners. I tend to be very hard edged. People pay me for the truth, to what I call shatter snow globes. But there are times, and I have a very specific time, when someone is in a severe grief, or children, where I hold space, what I call soft corners. And that's when I really use this law or this truth in my life. And so part of this is deciphering, when do you stay silent? When do you not need to say a word, but just simply provide grace and a space for healing? And when can you provide some mentorship, like we saw in Truth 9? So you have to have a lived experience, an individual experience of your hell, your lived earthly world experience, in order to understand the divine and the universal suffering. We are now entering the last three truths. Truth 10, 11, and 12 are directly related to universal consciousness that we started in Truth 9. Truth 10, in terms of silence and simplicity, contemplation, grace, and sound healing. Truth 11 will be of service, everything we learned in Truth 5 of individuation, owning our fire. Now we can warm others with that fire. And in Truth 12, to bring it home, is truth of unity, understanding that we are all one. And that's why in Truth 1, the truth of thought, all thoughts refer back to the thoughts we have about ourselves. But we're starting in the return home phase of the model. And therefore, things are starting to wind down, and they kind of seem like it's a winter, if we're going to use the expression of the principle of rhythm in the seasons. Atonement is something we oftentimes see in religion. This is not about beating ourselves up or suffering or paying, some sort of sacrifice to some god or some religion. This is simply stopping, staying in silence, identifying that you have created your personal hell. You could call it from previous karma, that you inherited that low-level consciousness, or any additional thing that you've created in suffering in the world, just because you weren't awakened enough and aware enough to know. And in a moment, we're going to reach the narrow door, the narrow gate. And it's through atonement that we can actually enter that space and navigate to hold space for another. It's through understanding that we are that in which we judge. We are that in which we came from. Many people on this path want to assume that they're so beyond the consciousness level at the moment of conception in their parents, and we're not. We actually only move 1 decima or 1 decanat, which is about 1/10. And within that, we can raise consciousness and we can transmute belief. But we always have to go back to see where we came from. And if we really take a glance and we look back, we've only moved a step or two. And so the atonement process is to recognize where we came from, that suffering was self-inflicted, that pain was our cause by our previous karma, our last lack of awareness in this lifetime or other lifetimes. It's not to beat ourselves up. So that with that ownership, we can transmute the belief around that we deserve suffering and pain. We can connect to the universal consciousness and then serve another in Truth 11. So this is the narrow door. Jesus on the Sermon of the Mount said, "Enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and spacious and broad is the way that leads away to destruction." In astronomy and astrology, we look at the narrow gate linked to Saturn and the Tropic of Capricorn. The broad gate is Cancer, the constellation. These are not by the signs. The constellation, which is the mass consciousness. We talked about Praesepe, we talked about the manger, that in that constellation, none of the lights are bright. That's the wider door. That's the easier thing to do. That's the socially acceptable thing to say and do without questioning our values, without questioning if we're self-betraying. It's following the mass consciousness. At Truth 10, we reach this narrow gate or narrow door with every single situation that shows up in our life. We decide if we're going to walk through or if we're not. And there isn't a wrong or right answer. There are times that we are absolutely going to walk through the narrow door and choose ourselves. The narrow door represents this glyph of Saturn. If you see this loop here. It's the cross that we bear. And it is a way that we're kind of becoming a diamond, pressured and contracted through this very narrow door that strengthens us. And it's when we choose ourselves, when we know our value system, that we walk through this door. And we're not always going to pick it. The hope is that with free will, we get to this door, and those moments that we can honor ourselves, that we cannot self-betray, we can walk through the narrow door, go upstream, choose what the mass consciousness is not choosing, and we can get sort of straightened out or alchemized, and we can become pressured like the diamond. And so he says, many are those who are entering through it. He's talking about the broad door, but the gate is narrow, contracted by pressure, and the way is straightened and compressed that leads away to life, and few are those who find it. How often do you reach a situation that you self-betray, that you don't answer the call to walk through the narrow door, say the thing that isn't popular, do the thing that honors your values, even though there's a death? Every time you choose the narrow door, there is a death associated with it. We talked about the law of octaves in prior classes. The triangle is thought. It is the intention. It is the air element that we inherit with the level of consciousness at the moment of conception. The square is this: limits, boundaries, saying no, honoring our value systems, our values, valere, our health. And walking through the narrow door requires you to do two things. Something must die, and you must mourn it. When you choose yourself, we do not have a prior template for choosing ourselves. It is not in our psyche. This is where the fire element shows up. We choose how much fire, how little fire we're going to give to propel through the door or stand back in fear on the sidelines. There's no right or wrong answer, but the more you go through the narrow door, the more you detach, the more you die, the bigger that astral body becomes, so that you can go through the mandorla and into a higher plane of consciousness in a next existence. And then, of course, inherit a higher low-level form of consciousness in your next one. So this is the door of karma. This is the door of cleansing. This is the door of atonement. This is the door of choosing yourself. And it is very difficult to choose ourselves when everyone else is going opposite. When we're questioning, when we're checking in with our values, when we don't want to self-betray, when we man our fires and choose to use that fire to propel us through the door rather than just standing back and going with the flow. This is always about limitations. The earthly element, the square in the law of octaves, has to do with something dying. So it's representative of the winter. All of the Christ consciousness or Buddha consciousness happens in Capricorn, Tropic of Capricorn, in the winter time, alone, limited, mourning, solace, that inward journey. Part of the truth of silence is also the contemplation, walking a labyrinth, taking a pilgrimage where you're in silence and really looking at your thoughts and how much they have transmuted and how much they haven't. So I have a one ingredient theory where I work with clients, and there is a one ingredient that is found in your story in its entirety. And I use this assignment called the stone soup. So stone soup was a kid's story where this villager or this passerby through a village came and set up his pot, hot water, and a stone. And nobody was coming out to meet or mingle the other people in the town. So he figured in the town square, he would set up his pot. And so all the nosy neighbors came out to find out who he was doing. What was this stranger doing? And he's like, oh, I'm making stone soup. And he's like, do you have something to contribute to the soup? So one villager came and brought celery, and the other one brought carrots, and the other one brought potato, and everybody had one ingredient. You only have one ingredient, one thread, one thought, emotion, desire, and level of consciousness in this lifetime to work through. That narrow door is a one thread of karma to burn. And if you weave your entire story together, what I call the stone soup assignment, it will pop out at you. Take all of the suffering, all of the pain, all of these hard moments in your life and put them on a little pieces of paper. And in a circular fashion, take a picture. And you will start to see the ingredient that is in your story that started at conception, through pregnancy, through birth, and then 0 to 7, and even into adulthood. That is your one ingredient. That is how you nurture self, individuate, and nurture others by service in Truth 11. And so there's this allegory of the long spoons. There's 2 rooms. One is considered to be heaven and one is considered to be hell. The one down here in the bottom is heaven and the one down here is hell. In hell, everybody is taking the long spoon and trying to feed themselves. And as you can see, there's slop all over the table. Nobody is getting fed. Whereas in heaven, the people are taking their spoon and feeding one another so that everybody from that ingredient, from that soup, is getting fed. Your ingredient feeds yourself. It fuels your fire. It tells you exactly your soul's purpose, your directed will of what you come to do in this lifetime. And then as a result, we're just starting this with this universal consciousness with truths 9 through 12, become the servant where you can actually nurture others, because in truth 5, you found the fire and you nurtured yourself. Everything that has happened to you, all of the pain and suffering, is grace. That is part of what this truth is about, and why we sit in silence and simplicity, to sort of understand that it's all grace. It all has served a purpose. It was all created by us to learn a teaching, to get a message, to reach this point of our stone soup, of our one ingredient, so that we can go into the world and start to nurture others. So another thing that this particular truth teaches about is limitations. I said to you earlier, with the narrow door comes limitations. And Saturn in astrology is the planet of limitations, boundaries, no limit structure. And the universal consciousness is unlimited. However, our consciousness is limited in our form. When we get these two working together, when we use the universal consciousness by transmuting and raising, using the fire to raise our beliefs, then we could show up in the world as our divine selves in our limited form. Then we stop using the body to harm. In Ayurveda, we talk about the senses or the faculties. They're known as tanmantras. And what this is using the senses to help. In Greek mythology, we have the Graces and the Muses. We can only experience the divine. We can only give our one ingredient. We can only atone and serve in the flesh. We cannot do any of this in the universal consciousness. So therefore, taking care of our body rather than using it for self-destruction and sacrifices and offerings for purification in an unhealthy way from Truth 6, we actually here start to use it to benefit us and connect with God. And the way that we do that is through the Graces and the Muses of Greek mythology, where we use our senses, no longer, for instance, our eyes to rob our fire, but rather to find the divinity in another and hear and smell and taste and feel. And so being a chef or cooking or going to a Broadway play or hearing some poetry or listening to some music is how we experience the senses in a way that helps us, and we own our limitation and identify that the divine lives within the limits, and we use our senses to help, not to hurt. So the Graces and the Muses, here are the different muses: epic poetry, history, flutes, music. Pick your poison, pick the one that you identify with, and bring in the divine through the limitation of your body, and use your senses to help instead of hurt. In Truth 2, we talked about the truth of desire. The body is flawed. The body has desires. You have to eat. You have to have sex. Perhaps you drink, whatever your issue is that your desirous body calls for. Everybody has somewhat of a poor coping mechanism due to the desirous body, but we only do that 48 to 52% of the time. The divine spark is the other 48 to 52% of the time. And the way that we honor the divine is through using our senses to bring in music and poetry and artwork. So this truth is silent simplicity and sound healing, or not only sound, but the senses, using the senses to heal. So one of the things when I teach Akashic Records, I teach the grace points. Grace points are points located on the hand that have trapped energy. And if we press on these points, we can start to release some of the stuck energy from the pain and suffering that was self-inflicted through our life. In the Vedas or in the Hindu tradition, there are the mudras, and here are some of the mudras. Most of you might have seen the Vishnu mudra when you're meditating. And what it is that each of the fingers has an element associated. So Akash, air, fire, water, earth. And putting together the different mudras manipulate the use of the elements. And then with the fire that we have control over, we can transmute whatever it is that the lower senses or the lower consciousness and use of the senses can help us to raise our vibration. Here's a link, and you can Google grace points and mudras if you want to learn about which mudras are helpful for what. Another thing we use is Yantras and Vastu Shastra. Now, these mudras, these grace points, these yantras, they're used so that we can move energy around. We can kind of get out of our own way energetically, but it does take the fire, it does take the transmutation of the belief so that actually behavior change and belief change can transmute and we can actually change our life. But these tools are very powerful in starting to move energies around, and we can do these in sound healing or silent healings when we do shamanic work or Akashic Records or Reiki or any of the energetic healing arts. So these are yantras. They are representations of the universe. In yantras, you're always going to have the 4 directions to honor the limitation of the body, the principle of the rhythm, and the 4 seasons. You're always going to have triangles that represent thought, the impure thought at the moment of conception, that with the fire element, you're going to transmute. You're always going to have circles that represent wholeness and the divine spark within. So triangles, circles, and squares are going to be seen in all the yantras as they're seen in the chakras, because they represent the 3 symbols that rule everything in the universe. This is a medicine wheel or a dream catcher medicine wheel that we use in shamanism. And you see the circles and the triangles. The feathers represent the earth element as the square. And Vastu Shastra is the Vedic version of Feng Shui, where we move furniture or construct buildings according to where the energy flows best. And again, humans only have control of the fire element. So we can put places in the earth, in the air, and the water placements, but it is our fire, it's our transmutation of belief that raises consciousness around whatever. So these are not all panaceas. These are not by any means panaceas. They're opportunities to set up the elements that we don't have control over so that we can show up with the capacity to transmute our fire so that we can indeed change our lives. And lastly, sound healing. This has become very popular. There is a placement for this in Truth 10. If we're not going to be speaking, we can shift energy or make movements in a person's energy body through sound. Sound is directly linked to the element of the Akash. When I read the Akashic Records, what I have understood is I see the image as a clairvoyant, but the Akash actually is a sound wave. And that sound wave becomes the clair, in my case, clairvoyant. If you feel it, you're clairsentient. If you smell it, you're clairgustissant. But it always comes in through the ether or the Akash. So sound healing taps in to that primary Akash or ether, what is known as the tanmantra, or the faculty, the sense of hearing. So here you have some drums from shamanism. This is Krishna Das. I listen to his Vedic chants on Hanuman Chalisa every morning. These are some sound bowls. These are the different Bij mantras, one for each of the chakras. Tuning forks. I used to use tuning forks on my crystals that were vibrating at each of the different chakras when I would do healings at my house. Here is the flute. In shamanism, when you're doing ayahuasca ceremonies, there's something called Icaros, which are the healing songs. This is the shofar from the Hindu tradition. This is Vishnu playing on the conch shell that makes sound waves to make change. There are hymns in the Christian tradition, and there are different frequencies that we use in the law of vibration or law of frequency to enact different frequencies connected to the earth. In this case, this is the love frequency. So sound healing has become very popular. And I just want to say it is part of this truth, just like contemplation, just like walking labyrinths, just like taking pilgrimages. But none of those in themselves create behavior change. They bring you to that narrow door. They help you to remove some of the noise that is from the impure thoughts, the emotions, and the desires, so that you can choose whether or not with your free will you want to enter the narrow gate, choose your value system, use your fire to propel you forward. Thank you very much.